They kicked me out of my own housewarming party at 65 years old, telling me I was too old to live in the dream home I'd spent 40 years building. I sat in that dingy motel room afterward, staring at the deed to my beautiful house, and wondering how my own son could humiliate me in front of everyone I cared about. The rain was tapping against the window like fingers drumming impatiently, and I felt every one of my 65 years weighing down on my shoulders. If you've ever poured your heart and soul into something only to have the people closest to you tear it down, if you've ever been made to feel like a stranger in your own life, then settle in, friend. Because this is a story about dreams, betrayal, and the kind of justice that comes when you least expect it. I'm Ezra, and what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family. That house wasn't just four walls and a roof to me. It was every overtime hour I'd worked as a county accountant, every brown bag lunch I'd packed instead of eating out, every vacation I'd skipped to save another dollar. For 40 years, I'd carried the blueprints of that dream home in my wallet, worn soft from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. My late wife Elena used to tease me about those blueprints, saying I looked at them more than I looked at her. The worst part wasn't even what my son Kieran said to me that night. It was the silence afterward, the way everyone at the party just stood there staring at their shoes while I gathered what was left of my dignity and walked out my own front door. I'd invited neighbors, old work friends and family members to celebrate the culmination of my life's work, and instead I got a masterclass in humiliation served up by my own blood. But you know what they say about hitting rock bottom? It gives you a solid place to push off from, and sometimes, when people show you who they really are, the best thing you can do is believe them the first time. If you're someone who thinks that respect should flow both ways, even between parents and children, if you believe that dignity isn't negotiable, then stick around. This story's got some surprises in store. I pulled out my phone in that motel room and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment, but sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that scare you the most. The conversation I was about to have would change everything, but after what happened at that party, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. If you're enjoying this tale of standing up for yourself when no one else will, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. I've got plenty more stories about second chances and the family we choose versus the family we're given. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Building that house was like watching Elena come back to life, one nail and one board at a time. She'd drawn those first sketches on our kitchen table 23 years ago, her coffee getting cold while she planned out every room, every window, every corner where our future grandchildren might play. The cancer took her before we could break ground. But I carried her vision with me like a sacred promise, determined to build the home we dreamed of together. I remember the day I finally bought the land, 5 acres of rolling hills, about an hour outside the city, with old oak trees that had probably been standing since before I was born. Elena had always said she wanted to wake up to the sound of birds instead of traffic, wanted a garden where she could grow tomatoes and sunflowers, wanted a front porch where we could sit and watch the sunset paint the sky. Standing on that empty lot with the deed in my hand, I could almost hear her voice telling me to get started. The construction took 3 years, and I was there every single day, working alongside the contractors when I wasn't at my accounting job. I learned how to lay tile, how to install light fixtures, how to paint trim work so it looked like it belonged in a magazine. My hands got calloused in new places, my back ached in ways it never had before, but every morning I'd drive out to that site and see our dream taking shape, and it felt like Elena was building it right alongside me. Kieran would visit the construction site occasionally, usually when Sloane sent him to check on Dad's project, as she called it. He'd walk through the framed rooms with his hands in his pockets, making comments about how much space one old man really needed, and suggesting I should consider something smaller, more practical. But he didn't understand that this house wasn't about practicality. It was about love, legacy, and keeping a promise to the woman who'd made my life worth living. When the house was finally finished, it looked exactly like Elena's drawings, only better. The front porch wrapped around two sides of the house with white columns and hanging baskets full of the petunias she'd always loved. The kitchen had a breakfast nook where morning light would stream through tall windows, and the master bedroom had French doors that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the garden I'd planted with her favorite flowers. I spent my first night in that house, sitting on the front porch steps, drinking a beer and listening to the crickets sing their evening song. The silence was different out there, not empty like the silence in my city apartment had been since Elena died, but full of possibility and peace. This was the life we'd planned together, and even though she wasn't there to share it with me, I felt closer to her in that house than I had anywhere else since she'd passed. For 6 months, I lived in that house like a man who'd finally found his way home after being lost for years. I tended Elena's garden, I cooked breakfast in the sunny kitchen, I sat on the porch every evening and called it good. I was already planning the housewarming party, thinking about how proud I'd be to show everyone what love and determination could build. I had no idea that the people I most wanted to impress were the same ones who would try to tear it all down. The first sign of trouble came when I invited Kieran and Sloane for dinner at the new house. I'd spent all day cooking Elena's famous pot roast recipe, setting the dining room table with the good china I'd been saving for special occasions, and arranging fresh flowers from the garden in the centerpiece. When they pulled up in their expensive SUV, I felt like a proud homeowner ready to show off his achievement to his family. Sloane walked through my house like she was conducting an inspection, running her manicured fingers along surfaces and making little humming sounds that didn't seem particularly impressed. "It's very rustic," she said, examining the handcrafted kitchen cabinets I'd spent weeks staining to perfection. "I suppose it has a certain farmhouse charm, though it does seem awfully large for just one person." Her tone made it sound like living alone in a beautiful house was some kind of character flaw. During dinner, the conversation kept circling back to practical concerns. The cost of heating such a big space, the maintenance involved in keeping up with the property, the distance from medical facilities if I had some kind of emergency. Kieran nodded along with his wife's observations, occasionally adding comments about how isolated I was out there, how it would be difficult for them to visit regularly given their busy schedules and the long drive. "Dad," Kieran said as we were having coffee on the porch, "you know we worry about you out here all by yourself. What if you fall down those stairs? What if you have a heart attack and there's nobody around to help you?" I tried to explain that I felt healthier and happier than I had in years, that the house gave me purpose and peace, but he just shook his head like I was being unreasonably stubborn about something obvious. The visits became less frequent after that dinner, and when they did come, Sloane would spend most of the time on her phone, sighing dramatically whenever I tried to show her some improvement I'd made to the property. She'd make comments about how much money I was wasting on landscaping and repairs, suggesting that I could be living more simply and not tying up so much capital in real estate that just sits empty most of the time. Kieran started bringing up the idea of downsizing during our phone calls, always framing it as concern for my well-being, but with an undertone that suggested I was being selfish somehow. "You could get a nice little condo closer to town," he'd say. "Think of how much less stress you'd have, not worrying about yard work and home maintenance." He never seemed to understand that the yard work and maintenance weren't burdens. They were the daily rituals that kept me connected to Elena's memory. The worst part was how they made me feel guilty for loving my own home. Every time I'd mention some project I was working on or some improvement I'd made, Sloane would get that tight smile on her face and say something about how nice it must be to have so much time and money to spend on hobbies. It was like they couldn't understand that this house wasn't a hobby. It was the manifestation of a 40-year love story. and I was the guardian of that story. The housewarming party was supposed to be my moment of triumph, the day I finally got to share Elena's dream with everyone who'd been part of our journey together. I spent weeks planning every detail, sending handwritten invitations to neighbors, old work colleagues, family members, and friends who'd heard me talk about this house for decades. I hired a local caterer, strung lights across the porch, and even had a small plaque made with Elena's favorite quote about home being where love lives. Kieran and Sloane arrived fashionably late, with Sloane wearing a white dress that looked more appropriate for a cocktail party than a backyard barbecue. She air-kissed my cheek and immediately started surveying the crowd with the kind of expression you'd wear while examining something unpleasant. "Well, Dad, you certainly went all out," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make it sound like criticism, disguised as a compliment. The party started beautifully. Neighbors admired the craftsmanship. Old friends marveled at how perfectly the house matched Elena's original drawings, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to see me so proud and settled. I was giving tours of the interior, showing off the built-in bookcases I'd installed myself and the master bathroom with the clawfoot tub Elena had always wanted. For a few hours, I felt like the luckiest man alive, surrounded by people who appreciated what I'd built. But as the evening wore on and Sloane had a few more glasses of wine, her comments became sharper and louder. She started telling people how concerned she and Kieran were about me rattling around in this big empty house, how they worried I was living in the past, instead of being practical about my declining years. Each comment felt like a small knife twist, designed to make me look foolish in front of people whose respect I valued. The breaking point came when I was showing my neighbor Martha the garden where I'd planted Elena's roses. Sloane appeared beside us, swaying slightly from the wine, and announced loud enough for half the party to hear, "You know, Martha, we keep trying to convince Ezra that he's too old for all this house and garden nonsense, but he won't listen to reason. He's determined to play house like he's still 30 instead of facing reality." The conversation around us died, and I felt every eye at the party turn toward us. My face burned with embarrassment and anger, but before I could respond, Sloane continued her public humiliation. "I mean, look at this place. It's obviously too much for one elderly man to handle. He should sell it and move somewhere more appropriate for someone his age, instead of trying to live some fantasy about being a country gentleman." Indeed, that's when Kieran stepped up beside his wife, and I thought for one desperate moment that he was going to defend me, to tell her she'd had too much to drink and should stop embarrassing his father in front of his guests. Instead, he put his arm around Sloane's shoulders and said, "She's right, Dad. This whole thing is getting out of hand. Maybe it's time to be realistic about what you can handle at your age." Dirty. The party fell completely silent, except for the sound of crickets and the distant music still playing from the speakers I'd set up on the porch. I stood there in my own backyard, surrounded by the people I'd invited to celebrate the achievement of my lifetime, and felt more alone than I'd ever felt since Elena died. My own son had just publicly agreed that I was too old and foolish to live in the house I'd built with my own hands, in front of everyone who mattered to me. What happened next will stay with me until the day I die. Sloane, emboldened by Kieran's support and loosened by wine, decided to finish what she'd started in front of my entire housewarming party. "Honestly, Ezra," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're embarrassing yourself with this whole charade. A 65-year-old man pretending to be some kind of homesteader? It's pathetic." The guests started shifting uncomfortably, some looking at their phones, others suddenly finding reasons to check on their drinks or visit the bathroom. I could see Martha's horrified expression, could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes watching this family drama unfold in my own backyard. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from the humiliation of being dressed down like a child by my daughter-in-law in front of everyone I'd invited to celebrate with me. Maybe, Sloane continued, swaying on her heels and pointing a manicured finger at me, it's time for you to pack up this little fantasy and let the adults enjoy the party. You've had your fun playing house, but now it's time to face reality and stop being such a burden on everyone who actually cares about you. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking, but the silence from Kieran was even worse. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and educated and sacrificed for, hoping to see some flicker of loyalty or love or simple human decency. Instead, he just stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground like he was studying the grass patterns. "Kieran," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "are you going to let her talk to me like this in my own home?" He finally raised his eyes to meet mine, and what I saw there broke something inside me that I don't think will ever heal. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone Sloane had been using all evening. "Maybe she has a point. Maybe it is time to think about making some changes. This house, this lifestyle, it's a lot for someone your age to handle." Indeed, the party emptied out quickly after that, with guests making awkward excuses and hurried goodbyes, avoiding eye contact as they filed out of my driveway. I stood on my front porch, the porch I'd built with Elena's dreams guiding every nail and every board, watching taillights disappear down the country road, leaving me alone with my son and daughter-in-law who'd just publicly destroyed me in front of everyone I cared about. When the last guest had gone, Sloane turned to me with a satisfied smile and said, "Well, I think that went well. Maybe now you'll listen to reason about downsizing." She walked past me into my house that I'd built with my own hands, and started collecting the leftover appetizers like she owned the place. Kieran followed her without a word, leaving me standing alone on the porch Elena and I had designed together. I spent that night in a motel room 20 miles away, staring at the water stains on the ceiling and listening to trucks rumble past on the highway. In my shirt pocket, I carried the deed to the house that had been my dream and my refuge, but now felt like a monument to my own foolishness. The rain started falling around midnight, and I lay there in that narrow bed wondering how I'd become a stranger in my own life, how the people who were supposed to love me had turned into my cruelest judges. I woke up in that motel room the next morning, knowing exactly what I had to do, and for the first time in months, I felt completely clear about my purpose. The humiliation of the night before had burned away all my confusion and doubt, leaving behind a kind of calm determination that surprised me with its strength. I called my lawyer before I even had coffee, setting up an appointment that would change everything. While Kieran and Sloane probably assumed I was nursing my wounds and reconsidering their practical advice about downsizing, I was actually making the most important decision of my later years. I drove to my niece Celeste's apartment in town, the same cramped place she'd been living in since the fire destroyed her previous home 6 months earlier. She opened the door with paint-stained fingers and a tired smile, her kids Luna and Atlas peeking out from behind her legs. "Uncle Ezra," Luna squealed, launching herself into my arms with the kind of pure joy that had been missing from my interactions with my own son for years. Atlas hung back shyly until I knelt down and showed him the pocket watch I always carried, Eleanor's father's watch that had fascinated every child who'd ever seen it. Within minutes, both kids were chattering about their school projects while Celeste made coffee in her tiny kitchen. Celeste had always been different from the rest of the family. As an elementary school teacher, she understood the value of patience, kindness, and seeing potential in people who might be struggling. When I'd invited her to the housewarming party, she'd been the only family member who seemed genuinely excited about my achievement, asking detailed questions about the construction and telling me how proud Eleanor would have been. "Celeste," I said after the kids had settled down with coloring books, "I want to show you something." I pulled out the deed to my house and spread it on her small kitchen table. Her eyes widened as she read the legal documents, but before she could ask questions, I started explaining what had happened at the party, how Kieran and Sloane had humiliated me in front of everyone I cared about. They think I'm too old to live in my own house, I said, watching her face carefully. They think I should sell it and move into some senior facility where I won't be an embarrassment to anyone. But here's the thing, sweetheart. I didn't build that house for Kieran. I built it for Elena, and for the kind of family she always believed we could be, the kind of family that shows up for each other, that celebrates each other's dreams instead of tearing them down. When I told her my plan, Celeste started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen from Sloane when she wanted something, but the kind of honest emotion that comes from being overwhelmed by unexpected kindness. "Uncle Ezra," she whispered, "I can't let you do this. That house is your dream, your connection to Aunt Elena. You can't just give it away because Kieran and Sloane are being horrible." But I'd already made up my mind. That house was built with love, and it deserves to be lived in by people who understand what love means, I told her. Your kids need stability. You need a real home where you can plant roots, and I need to know that Elena's dream is being honored by people who won't take it for granted. Besides, I added, with the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks, I can't think of anything that would drive the point home to Kieran quite like this. The deed transfer was completed on a Thursday morning in my lawyer's office, with Celeste holding Luna on her lap and Atlas playing quietly with toy cars on the carpet. The lawyer explained all the legal implications, made sure Celeste understood the property taxes and maintenance responsibilities, and officially transferred ownership of my dream house to the woman who'd always treated me like family instead of a burden to be managed. Celeste cried through the entire process, thanking me over and over until I finally had to tell her to stop, because she was making an old man get emotional too. "You're giving me and the kids a real home," she kept saying, but she had it backward. She was giving me the gift of knowing that Elena's house would be filled with laughter and love, with children's voices echoing through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. We moved her and the kids into the house that same weekend, and I moved into a comfortable apartment in town that was perfect for one person who wanted to be close to libraries, restaurants, and the kind of community activities that actually suited a 65-year-old man. Watching Luna and Atlas discover the garden, the big bedrooms, and the wraparound porch felt like watching Elena's original vision finally come to life the way she'd always intended. Kieran found out about the deed transfer 3 weeks later when he drove out to the house, probably planning to pressure me again about selling. Instead, he found Celeste planting new flowers in the front garden while Luna and Atlas played on the porch swing I'd installed last summer. The conversation, as Celeste later told me, was brief and loud, and ended with Kieran screeching out of the driveway like a teenager having a tantrum. He called me that evening, angrier than I'd ever heard him in his entire life. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted into the phone. "That house was supposed to be my inheritance. You had no right to give away my future without even discussing it with me." I listened to his rant calmly, waiting for him to run out of steam before I responded. "Son," I said when he finally paused for breath, "you made it very clear at that party that you thought the house was too much for me to handle. You agreed with your wife that I was being foolish and unrealistic about my capabilities, so I took your advice and made some practical decisions about my living situation. I just didn't make the decisions you expected me to make." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a long moment before Kieran tried a different approach, alternating between guilt trips and threats, promises of reconciliation, and warnings about legal challenges. But I'd learned something important from that devastating night at my housewarming party. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are actually the ones who respect you the least. And sometimes the family you choose is more valuable than the family you're born with. 6 months later, I'm living my best life in my cozy apartment, volunteering at the community center, taking cooking classes, and spending weekends at the house that's now officially Celeste's, but will always feel like home to me. Luna calls me Grandpa Ezra. Atlas has learned to help me in the garden, and Celeste makes sure I know I'm welcome anytime, for any reason, no questions asked. Kieran still calls occasionally, usually when he's having financial problems, or when Sloane reminds him that sucking up to me might be his only path back to an inheritance. But I've discovered something wonderful about being 65 and finally free from the obligation to make other people's poor behavior my problem. I get to choose who deserves my time, my energy, and my love. And I choose people who choose me back. If you've made it this far, you know that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and surrounding yourself with people who see your worth instead of constantly pointing out your flaws. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you had to choose your own happiness over someone else's expectations. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about second chances, chosen family, and the beautiful art of not giving a damn what ungrateful people think about your life choices.